episode 36 of That 60s Recording Podcast, the podcast that has conversations inspired by the golden era of recording. I hope you've all had a fantastic week. This week, I am extremely excited to have Steve Jackson on the podcast, who is the man responsible for reviving Pultec, who obviously make the renowned EQ that everybody seems to have used the plugin for, and there is quite a lot of original units. But anyway, Steve went about and tried to recreate. He's an electrical engineer, and he went and tried to recreate the Pultec unit, and then somehow ended up reviving the company. And in the process, he got managed to speak to Eugene Shenk, who was the original founder of Pultec, and yeah, it's just an amazing story to hear how he went from a sort of budding enthusiast, although, you know, he's a professional electrical engineer, so he's a bit more than an enthusiast. But it's interesting to see how he went from that to running the company. And he talks about some real technical details, actually. I was really keen to get him to speak about some technical stuff. So, you know, actually going through I'm going to list off some electrical components here and pretend that I know what I'm talking about. So transformers, tapped inductors, which I didn't know a huge amount about, voltage dividers, capacitors, potentiometers, and all things that make me sound like I know what I'm on about. And he talks about what makes the Pultec EQ so special. I keep saying this, but this is it's got to be now one of my favourite conversations. I've absolutely loved it. Okay, so also my isolated drums this week that I'm sending out are Dizzy Miss Lizzie. So if you're interested in that, you can go to my website, allyouneedisdrums.com, and sign up to get yours. And that's that. So we'll just dive straight into this conversation. Here we go, Steve Jackson. I am really excited today to be joined by Steve Jackson of Pulse Techniques. Thanks so much for speaking to me, Steve.
Oh, my pleasure.
So could you just start off by telling everybody what's your position within Pultec now?
I am, I guess, president, owner, whatever you want to call it. We're a very small company, about 5 people total currently. So we definitely fit into the boutique audio category. And interestingly enough, that's about the size of the original company back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. You know, we're very much following in the footsteps of the original company. Yeah.
I think that will surprise a lot of people because Pultec's obviously. I hope you. I mean, obviously, I hope you don't mind me calling it Pultec. It's obviously Pulse Techniques is the full name, and that's kind of been shortened more commonly to Pultec now.
Yeah, intentionally. It's you know, Pultec is the brand name and the trademark, and you know, that's what I call it 90% of the time.
So it's obviously it's such a well-known brand, and the idea that there's only maybe 5 people working for the company just seems mind-boggling. I think that will surprise an awful lot of people how small it is to have such a huge reputation.
Well, you know, the reputation of Pultec, I can't take credit for. You know, Gene Shenk and Ollie Summerlin conceived the company back in the early 50s. Gene was working for RCA, had worked there about 17 years, I believe, and you know, had started out taking electronics classes at RCA Institute, and then after completing his 2-year program, was hired by RCA and went on to design wide bandwidth amplifiers for the company, and you know, just really developed into an incredible engineer, but always had this desire to have his own company and, you know, to start his own business. And so he and Ollie quit their regular jobs and started Pulse Techniques in I believe 1953, 1954 time frame. And all the credit goes to Gene. That company thrived for multiple decades, and in the early '80s, about 1982, they closed their doors. And the only thing I can take credit for is breathing life back into the products, into the company again. Um, that was about a 10-year effort on my part, but all of the designs that we manufacture are Gene Shenk's original designs, and he was really the brains behind the Pultec products.
How did you? Did the original germination of you sort of taking over the company start in around early 2000? Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah. So it really didn't start as me trying to bring the company back to life. I was building. My wife and I in '97 had finally gotten a house that had a basement that I wanted to build a studio in, and um, I had worked as a recording engineer a couple of decades before that, but had gotten out of the business and gone to grad school and um, started working in optoelectronics for Hewlett Packard. And um, I wanted to get back into recording, but knew that wasn't an option for me to go, work for a studio. So I wanted to build a home studio. And of course, I wanted, some great outboard gear, and started looking around at, what I could buy. And, Pultecs were selling for anywhere from $6,000 to $12,000 a piece. And I knew that wasn't going to be in the budget. But I was a PhD electrical engineer. I thought, I ought to be able to hack something together with existing components, find some good audio transformers and you know, track down some details about the schematic. And so that's really all I started out to do was build a couple of uh, I won't really call them clones, just you know similar EQs to be able to use in my studio. And there were a couple of other guys that I knew that were professional recording engineers, and somehow they ended up talking me into trying to recreate the Pultec. And I thought, yeah, okay, well, we'll give this a year. Well, it ended up taking about 10 years. And pretty much every waking hour, I was still working full time for Hewlett Packard, uh, doing research and development in their Fort Collins facilities. And so, it was evenings and weekends that I would dabble with trying to characterize the original transformers and try to figure out, where I could have them made, and went through multiple manufacturers with all sorts of nightmare stories that I won't go into here. But let's just say that, manufacturers don't always do what you ask them to do. I tore down the original transformers turn by turn, layer by layer, and had them very well documented, and would give that documentation to the manufacturer, and they would give me back something that barely resembled what I had given them. And so it took a number of iterations, a lot of hard work to really get this right. But um, my partners at that time and I had agreed that unless we could do a perfect Pultec clone, it was never going to see the light of day. That there were already some, I don't want to say compromised designs, but there were Pultec clones out there that didn't sound anything like Pultecs. And we knew, we had to hit the mark and hit it solidly in order to be able to get anybody to buy the product. So um, that's why it took so long. These transformers, back in the day, they were designed by, some of the engineers that had designed the radar systems and other sophisticated electronics of World War II. And so, these transformers were made in the heyday of audio transformers. And those companies either were no longer in existence or they no longer manufactured those products. So the transformers were critical, getting those right. that's the heart and soul of a Pultec, is that transformer set.
So there's just um, there's no other use for them out there now. So no one else was making them at all. It really was a case of starting from scratch.
Exactly.
And in terms of the sort of company name, at this point, were you even considering the fact that it might go out? It might go out as a product named Pultec at that stage, or were you just what was happening in terms of Pulse Techniques as a company and your involvement with it at that point?
Well, fairly early on, I tracked down Eugene Shenk, which was no small task. That he was no longer living in New Jersey, where Pulse Techniques had been based, and he had retired and moved away. And without going into all the details, I did finally track him down and had a phone conversation with him. And the first time I approached him, he really didn't want to have anything to do with it. I don't know exactly what the situation was. I know he was a little bit, at least disappointed, if not bitter, about not being able to sell the company in the early '80s when he was ready to retire. His wife's health was failing. His partner, was dealing with health issues, and they just really didn't want to run the company, and they thought they could sell it, and they couldn't find a buyer, and so basically the doors just closed, and there was no big payoff at the end, like you would think you would have for a company of that stature. And he was aware of some of the people that were claiming to be making Pultecs, and was also aware of the fact that they weren't really hitting the mark. And so when I approached him, it was like, here's somebody else, trying to capitalize off my work. And I really wanted to partner with him. By that point, I had kind of gotten obsessed with being able to recreate this thing. It was, one of my partners basically at the beginning said it can't be done. And that was throwing down the gauntlet. It's like, okay, I'll show you it can't be done. But anyway, when I talked to him, I just explained to him that I was working with this and that I had some questions, and I don't remember the details of the first call. I just know that he was hesitant to engage, and I ended up calling him back a few months later with a question about the tapped inductor, and I think he realized at that point that I was really going to be doing this in detail, that I was not going to try to hack something together, that I was serious about recreating every aspect of it. And so he started to share some information, and we subsequently ended up having 12 or 14 conversations, on the order of 45 minutes to an hour each. And I think we kind of developed a relationship. I ultimately ended up meeting his family, his children, and met with them, and actually spent a long weekend with them. And this was after he had passed away.
Yeah.
He, fortunately, he was able to see the first production units, and I sent him photographs. He was suffering from some medical conditions and didn't want to meet in person. I'd asked him if I could come out and do an interview of him for the Audio Engineering Society, for AES, to document some of this. And, I took copious notes every time I talked to him, but I was really hoping to be able to get either an audio or maybe a video interview with him. And because of his health issues, he said he just didn't want to meet with anybody in person. And so I never was able to do that. But he was incredibly helpful. We talked a lot about his manufacturing techniques and about the details of the company. And, I later learned a lot more from his children, who who actually worked for their dad. Both of his daughters knew how to solder, and they would go into Pulse. When he had a bunch of orders that he needed help on, they'd go in and they'd, do soldering and mechanical assembly and that sort of thing. So,
Fantastic.
yeah, like I said, it was a small operation, but very efficient. He had he had friends who, when he would get a big order, they would come in and get a kit of parts, maybe for 10 units, and they would take them home and they would assemble them and then bring back the 10 units. And Gene and Ollie would test them and pack them and ship them. And so, very much a small time operation, but from what I've been able to deduce, I think they shipped over 15,000 products.
Wow.
15,000 units. Now, that was a lot of different products. Some, were just passive EQs, but I've seen serial number tags up in the 15,000s. And as best I can tell, they just used sequential serial numbers. Every box that went out got the next tag. So,
That's unbelievable. I'd read about the engineers building the units in their homes, and the idea that they got through that many is astounding. It's
yeah.
unbelievable.
But you've
Um,
also got to remember that they were in business from 1954 until 1982. So that's a pretty good stretch of time.
yeah, it really is. And do you think? I mean, what do you think was the cause of not being able to sell the company? Were people, 80s is around the time when sort of valve technology started to become unpopular, and there's
Exactly.
the EMI was switching from the red desks over to the TG desks, and suddenly everything was moving away from valve technology. Do you think that's the main reason?
I think that was a part of it. And Gene had seen that happening and acted on that. He started in early 1970s. He started manufacturing a solid state unit that used, among others, the API 2520. There were a couple of other brands of op amp that he used, but they're all that same, that same topology and footprint. So, and he actually thought that the solid state units were superior to the tube units.
Oh, interesting.
Um, but I guess it just wasn't enough, and he did get one last big order. They had actually closed the doors and shut things down. They must have still had inventory, and I've not. Unfortunately, I didn't get to talk with Gene about this, but I've talked with people who know Tony Bon Jovi, who owned Power Station in New York City, and basically what happened, Gene had shut things down, and Tony was building, this new studio in New York, and wanted Pultecs in each of the control rooms. And there were, I believe, 3 control rooms at that time, and he wanted 24, one for each track of the multi-track machine, for each control room.
Wow.
And so, that order alone would be, 75 units. And so, 72. But anyway, when Tony first approached him, he said, no, I'm done. We've closed the doors. And he said it would have to be, a very sizable order. And I don't know, chicken and the egg, which came first, whether Tony was originally planning on doing that many, or he just said, if that's how many I have to get you to build them, a few, then I'll be all in. But from what I can tell and talking with various people, I think the order probably ended up being closer to 100, because they had some MEQ5s in addition to the EQ P1A 3s, and they also had some spare units. So my guess is it was close to 100 units. And so Gene, set up and built those units and then closed the door, permanently.
Wow, quite a high to go out on. That's really
Yeah,
cool. I
yeah,
did,
very much so.
yeah, I hadn't heard that story. That's really cool. I'm I'm quite interested, obviously, with your experience as an engineer, sort of electrical engineer. I'm curious, just from my own personal interest, about the. So I know that Eugene Shenk started off as at a point as a TV engineer, and what's the relationship between the way that a valve operates in a TV from back then, and how it operates in a unit? Because it seems to me that a lot of these electrical engineers from sort of the late 50s or early 50s into the 60s were familiar with radio and TV engineering first.
Right. Well, analog audio amplification is pretty much the same no matter what it's in. I mean, obviously, you've got some much higher frequencies in a television, in the IF stage, and I honestly don't know a whole lot about televisions, even though when I was a kid, I would help my dad pull all the tubes out of our TV and take them to the store where they had a tester and plug them all in. So I guess I got exposed to vacuum tubes, at a pretty early age, probably 8 or 9 years old. But
Wow.
obviously at that age, I didn't know anything other than you pulled them out, you put them in the tester, you adjusted the settings to whatever the scroll told you to set them to, and then pressed the test button. And if it failed, you bought a new one. Um, but I mean, analog electronics is not so different, I think, between a television and an audio equalizer. Obviously, there's an audio stage, in the television.
Yeah,
So,
yes, yeah, of
uh,
course.
yeah. Um,
So then, once they'd started Pultec as a company, the from the reading I've done, it seemed to me that they were starting out really niche with the units that they were manufacturing. Um, I've got one that I mean, I'm out of my depth talking about electronics to this degree, but the Model P1 audio oscillator seems
right.
to be the first unit that they built that seemed to. Uh, I mean, that seems incredibly specialized, and they struggling to sell those, or were they struggling
So,
to get the company moving?
so actually, that you raise a good point. They did not start out the business to manufacture audio equalizers. That actually came a little later. Um, they started out the business, and I can very much relate to this, having worked for Hewlett Packard for 25 years. They started out building test equipment and source equipment. So a variable filament supply, tube filament supply was the first product, I believe. And then they did an oscillator, which I actually have the prototype oscillator that you just referenced. I have
Wow.
that here at Pultec.
The
Uh,
original one.
the original one. It
Wow,
has like
fantastic.
Dymo label. Um, it's not even silk screened. It's got. Are you familiar with the Dymo labeler? It
I
was a
can't
little
say I am,
plastic
no.
strip that you rotate the letter that you want to a point on the device, and then you squeeze the handle and it imprints that letter, and so you can make labels that has an adhesive back. And
Oh yes, sorry, I know what you're
yeah,
talking about. Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
yeah. And I was stunned. I thought that was a product of the 70s, but clearly, this goes back. Actually, I did a little research on the Dymo labeler and found out, wow, it was around in the 50s.
How
But
cool.
anyway, yeah, I have that unit here. Unfortunately, it got slightly damaged being shipped to me, but I have it in a display case here at Pultec. So, but anyway, getting back to what we were discussing, um, they were manufacturing test equipment and oscillators, power supplies, that sort of thing. And Gene said there were a number of times that they thought that they were going to have to close their doors, that it wasn't going to go anywhere, and he was maybe going to have to go back and try to get his job at RCA again. But they were persistent, and it was really when they came up with this, this first prototype of the EQ P1 equalizer. Equalizers in that day were all passive. They didn't have a makeup gain, and so you incurred, anywhere from 3 to 20 dB of loss anytime you inserted a filter of some sort. Mm-hmm. And so Gene, came up with this equalizer that had a makeup gain stage, and his last job at RCA had been to design wide bandwidth amplifiers for I've forgotten exactly what they called it. It was basically an early facsimile machine, a fax machine, where you could over radio waves you could send images, and so these amplifiers obviously had to be very wide bandwidth. And I think Gene just was so into doing the wide bandwidth design that he didn't bother with a 20 to 20 kilohertz bandwidth amplifier for his equalizer. If you look at the frequency response of a Pultec, it's flat. My audio precision can only go down to 10 hertz, and there's no sign that it's rolling off. So I don't actually know what the low end rolls off at on a Pultec. I don't have anything that can measure it. But even on the top end, it doesn't start to roll off until around 60 kilohertz. And so I think that's one of the reasons that they sound so good, because you don't have, if you look at a lot of audio amplifiers, they're starting to drop by 18 kilohertz, and by 20, they're down 3 dB. And there's a lot of phase stuff going on with that transition. And, that impacts, the audio spectrum. And so, with Gene's amplifier, he's flat out to 60 something. And so, the 20 to 20 is just perfectly flat. And, that's just one of the reasons that Pultecs sound the way that they do. And if you look at some of the clones, you'll see that they don't always do that.
Well, this is, I think I mentioned it in an email to you. I had a conversation with Ivana Manley, and this is one of the same points that she brought up about Pultecs, is that just the huge amount of headroom on it, and especially with, obviously this is not relevant to sort of 50s and 60s, but now we've got plugins doing things, and they clearly don't have that same headroom. It can't, it's cut right off, which is another appeal for. I don't know whether that's even it's ever gonna be able to be emulated, or whether outboard gear will always persist for that very reason.
Right.
So, sound quality at that time was, from the research I've done, was improving anyway. 78 RPM was moving aside for 33 and a half, or 33 and a third, and it seemed to me that as audio quality was improving in general, that they hit the market at a good time with this EQ unit, because there was a demand from. So am I right in thinking the first test unit went to MGM in New York, and they loved it, which is obviously a huge contract for them to have landed.
Exactly. Ollie Summerland, who was Gene's partner, and Ollie was more like Gene was really the electrical design engineer. Ollie was marketing and mechanical engineer. He did a lot of the mechanical layout, where do the switches mount, and where do the transformers mount, and all of that sort of thing. Gene was more focused on the electrical aspects. And Ollie also had worked in a number of recording studios, and so he was the one that had the connection. And if you want the details of that, you can go to the Pultec website, and there's a history there that Gene's son-in-law wrote with Gene.
Wow.
I believe that was like around 1990 that they sat down and Mark just completely documented that, and he was kind enough to allow me to post that on our website. So, but it walks through, Gene's whole background of, when he was in high school, he was doing television repair, and radio. Actually, I take that back. I don't think he was doing repair at that time. He was selling radios. I need to go back and refresh my memory on the history, but
I think you're right. I've read through it all. He was doing radio repair from his parents' house, and this was while he
yes,
was in high school.
yes,
Clearly, it was like a really gifted guy.
yeah, just really smart, and convinced his parents to let him go to New Jersey and or New York, I guess, and study at the RCA Institute. Um, and I think back then I think he went for 2 years, which I believe would probably be close to the equivalent of a bachelor's degree now. I think it was a very concentrated coursework, and um, anyway, he obviously got sufficient training, and then with his 17 years of employment with RCA, he was definitely well equipped when he started Pulse Techniques.
There will be a lot of people listening to this who will be familiar with Pultecs, whether it's through a plug-in version or maybe a studio they visited, or and there'll be others who perhaps have them who will know this stuff. But could you, in your words, could you give us a brief rundown of the EQ P1A and how it works in terms of in terms of how it sustained its reputation for so many years? Why do people want it, and not necessarily the nuts and bolts of how it works, but in your own words, how you'd explain how it works and its legacy?
So it's basically a passive EQ section. In other words, all of the components are resistor, inductor, or capacitor. No active components to modify frequency response curves, and then that's followed by a line amplifier. And what I think is so cool is just how simple the design really is. If you have any electronics background at all, you know what a voltage divider is, which is, it's just a pair of resistors. One is in series with the incoming signal, and the other one is in shunt or tied, to ground across the output. And the output is where those two resistors connect. And the ratio of the one that's connected to ground versus the one that's connected to the input determines how much voltage drop you see across that voltage divider. And so the Pultec is basically a voltage divider. It's an 11-to-1. There's a 1K high frequency attenuate pot, over on the right side of the unit.
Mm-hmm.
And to the left of that, there's a 10K high frequency boost pot. And those two pots form that voltage divider that drops the incoming signal by 1/11th. It's it's R2 over R1 plus R2. If R1's your incoming, and sorry, I don't mean to get too involved, and especially when you can't sketch it, it takes 1,000 words to describe it. But that is the core of a Pultec. If you take 20 times the log of that, you will get the attenuation in dB, which is just under 21 dB. So it's 20 times the log of 1/11th, which is about 20.8 dB. So the signal coming in is attenuated by that much. And if you were to just monitor that output, you just have a voltage divider. Gene then took various passive components and placed them around that voltage divider to accomplish the curves that he wanted. So, for example, if you take an inductor and a capacitor, and you use that to bypass the series resistor. Then at a certain frequency, that inductor and capacitor will start to resonate. And at some point, their series resistance, their series impedance is approximately zero. And so it shorts the input to the output, and you get the full input at the output stage. So that is the peak boost circuit. If you now follow that attenuator with a line amplifier, you say, okay, well, I'm dropping 20 dB across this divider. I need to bring that back. So you put a 20 dB amplifier following it. Now you get your same input back, but when you resonate that LC, you're now actually getting all of your original signal plus the 20 dB that your line amp is producing. And so you get 20 dB of boost at that resonant frequency. Wow. And I won't bore everyone with all the other details of the other circuits, but it's basically a very simple yet elegant design. And the heart and soul of it is the quality of the line amplifier. So, like I said before, he picked up a Peerless catalog, which those were the Rolls-Royce transformers back in the 50s. And he picked the best output transformer that money could buy. Similarly, his input and interstage transformers on the initial units, they were all Peerless. Later, he went to Triad for the input and interstage, but the original EQ P1s and some of the very early EQ P1As had all Peerless transformers. But they were top quality transformers. They were very transparent, yet at the same time, they add a little magic that I have yet to be able to put my finger on. And I've been through every component in the Pultec, and I can't tell you, oh, here's the component that makes it sound like a Pultec. It's the culmination of the entire design that makes it sound like a Pultec. There's not one component that I can point to and say, this is what makes it. I can say if you're missing one component, it doesn't sound like a Pultec. So you have to get every one of them right. And the tapped inductor is crucial. We have those wound to the original specifications. I have the original design documents for that component, and we wind them to those original specs. Similarly, the input, interstage, and output transformer are all built to the original specs. We don't cut any corners, and that's why they sound like Pultecs.
Was there a moment in your... I mean, it's so... I'm really enjoying listening to you talk about it. Your passion for it comes across in droves. Was there a moment when you were recreating it that magic all came together and you went, I think this might be it?
I guess what I have to say is long before that, there were times that I didn't think I was ever going to get to the end of the road. that I had to wonder, I'm spending all this time in my basement. I'm, not spending this time with my family, with my children, with my wife. I'm spending our resources, a big chunk of my paycheck coming in from Hewlett Packard is going for prototype transformers. And I think my wife and some of my friends may have thought an intervention is necessary, because like I said, I had some issues with some of the manufacturers. I would, one in particular, the output transformer, I had thoroughly documented how it needed to be wound. I got a prototype back, put it into the chassis, and the unit was oscillating at 800 and something kilohertz. And we couldn't get it to not oscillate. It turned out that they had made some changes. They'd swapped some windings, some layering, and they had created a parasitic that didn't exist in the original transformer that caused it to oscillate. So, that sort of frustration, there were times that I was almost ready to throw in the towel, but I guess I'm just too stubborn. And I do remember the first prototype. So the very early prototypes, whenever I had something that I thought was getting pretty close, I would take them out to I was working here in Fort Collins, and I would take them out to Los Angeles, and we had access to Henson Recording, formerly A&M. And we would, they had a dozen Pultecs in every control room. And so we had lots of references to be able to compare to, and, incredible listening environment as well. We'd say, yeah, it's really close, but, I had a unit that had some of the prototype transformers, and then it would also have, originals. So we could kind of switch back and forth, and we would know, okay, this one has original input and output, but it's got the prototype interstage. And so we could isolate, and we would go through that process and say, we're really close, but it's still not quite there. And I'd go back and, back to Colorado and work on it for another 6 months, and then bring another prototype out. And yeah, that time when we all met at Royal Tone and plugged the thing in, and we had a vintage unit there, and it was like, that's it. We're there. I can't tell the difference. And we had, engineers who had really good ears that were listening and saying, I can't tell the difference between the two. That was kind of the moment that I thought, okay, I think it was all worth it. It's finally there. Now we just need to figure out how to build them and how to sell them.
The next challenge.
Because obviously, I couldn't build them myself. That was not going to happen. So,
when you were working on the sort of prototype unit, is there much difference between the units that Eugene built or his engineers built throughout the company history? Did they change depending on what materials were available at certain times? And did you have a particular era of unit in mind in that case that you were aiming for?
So regarding the EQ P1 and 1A, the very early units had one type of inductor, and then he switched to another manufacturer in that early period, and stayed with them for the next 30 years. And we elected to go with the one I had characterized and documented both of them, and we decided to go with the one that was in the majority of Pultecs, probably in 90% of the Pultecs. Also, we stayed with his decision to use the triad for the input and the interstage, and obviously the Peerless for the output. That's the one that has the feedback, the tertiary feedback winding, and I mean, it really is the heart and soul of the Pultec. The other two, contribute, but I actually had a couple of UTC transformers that came pretty close to the triads, but for the input and the interstage. But and similarly, we tried the Peerless, and we just didn't see really any differences there. And so, like I said, ended up staying with his decision of the triad for the input and interstage, and stayed with the Peerless for the output.
Okay, so there we have it. Part 1 of my conversation with Steve Jackson. Part 2 will be coming next week. There's not really much more else to say. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can do that. My email address is joe@allyouneedisdrums. If you'd like to support the podcast by buying a mug, you can do that at my website. There's a link to the shop there. That just leaves me to say thank you to Joe Kane and David Henshaw for the lovely music and artwork they supply for this. And I'll be back with you next week with more from Steve Jackson. Until then, goodbye!